Hello, good evening. My name is Samer Shahata, and I teach here at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies at Georgetown University. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have our colleague and a friend, Professor Joseph Sassoon, discussing the release of his new book. There are few occasions in academic life that are more worthy of celebration than the publication of a book, and certainly none more so than the publication of a major book, and that's what this is likely to be. Professor Sassoon is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. He is also a senior associate member at St. Anthony's College in Oxford. During the 2010-2011 academic year, he was a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars here in Washington, D.C. During the spring term, he is a visiting fellow at All Souls College in Oxford. Professor Sassoon was born in Baghdad and completed his PhD at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. He has published extensively on Iraq and its economy and on the Middle East, including two previous books, Economic Policy in Iraq, 1932 to 1950, published in 1987, and The Iraqi Refugees, The New Crisis in the Middle East, published in 2009, in addition to numerous book chapters and other publications. His new book, based on Ba'ath documents, is entitled Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, Inside an Authoritarian Regime, and it was published by Cambridge University Press in mid-December 2011. Professor Sassoon will speak for 25-30 minutes, as long as you'd like, and then that will be followed by a few brief remarks on my part as a discussant, and then we will open up the session to questions and discussion afterwards.
Samer, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you for the center for arranging everything, and special thanks to Marina, who really did all the work. My book is an attempt to understand the inner workings of a modern Arab state from its own meticulous records rather than journalistic or secondary sources. For the first time, we are able to delve into the functioning of a one-party Arab state in the grip of a powerful authoritarian ideology. It is the study of the party's activities and modus operandi when it ruled the country between 1968 and 2003. My research relied primarily on the massive archive of government documents captured by the United States after the fall of Saddam Hussein in April 2003. These contain the records of the Ba'ath Party, the intelligence services, mainly the Special Security Organization, the Diwan, which is the presidential offices, and the Ministry of Information, as well as audio tapes of the meetings of the Revolutionary Command Council. Altogether, provide unparalleled insights into the ideology and structure of Saddam Hussein's regime. Whereas the documents reveal the decisions made, the tapes capture the spontaneity of private discussions among the country's leaders. These archives of the Ba'ath regime illustrate in minute detail how the different arms of the state function, how the intelligence services gathered information, recruited informers, carried out their surveillance of society. Reports were filed by all levels of the party hierarchy and were meticulously cross-referenced. From these records and countless memos, we can build a unique picture of the regime. I also researched documents taken out by the Kurds in 1991 and handed into the US. Human Rights Watch published a selection of these reports on its website and graphically described the bureaucracy of repression portrayed in these documents. The description of these documents of the 80s is applicable to the majority of the documents, and let me quote: The language is numbingly dry, the format highly formalistic. Written thus, the documents bespeak the daily tedium of career civil servants hewing closely to establish bureaucratic procedure. The all-pervasive Iraqi bureaucracy manifests itself in another fashion, through the simple mechanism of referencing. The documents are linked to one another in a vast and complex administrative web. Official decrees are issued from high and passed down the ranks in a fashion, the meticulous cross-referencing that is characteristic of the Iraqi documents simply reflects the complexity of daily life in a sophisticated modern state. End of quote. Although the regime laid strong emphasis on filing, we do not have much information about the filing system they used. We do know that filing continued uninterrupted during the Gulf War and even for a couple of weeks after the invasion of 2003. The regime created its own terminology and expanded it over time. For example, Mu'tamin, the trusted one, became the term for an informer. Arus al-Thawrat, the bride of all revolution, was the coup d'etat of February 8, 1963, which catapulted the Ba'ath into power for the first time. And numerous metaphors refer to special days of celebrations and to organization, such as Munazzamat al-Munadhalin, the organization for party veterans, which actually was nothing but an organization for retired senior Ba'athists. Let me start first with discussing the durability of the regime. There are many ways to interpret the durability of the regime. Some argue that a dictatorship could not run by one man alone, however unrestricted his power was. There is a recognition that dictatorships flourish on wide complicity, fueled by a variety of motives from idealism to fear, and that makes great sense of their durability. In Iraq, the Ba'ath Party was one of three pillars of governance, together with the military and the bureaucracy, but it was more important than the other two. This differed from the Ba'ath regime in Syria under the first Assad, where the army was far more central because of the military background of the party's leaders. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein deliberately weakened the military as part of his coup-proofing, and the party became the essential core of the political system's command and control of the country. The Ba'ath's ideological domination of the armed forces began immediately after the party seized power on July 30, 1968, and the party machinery soon operated across all military ranks. Historically, Iraq has developed a competent civil service that managed day-to-day administration, but the party slowly but surely crept into this bureaucracy and succeeded in bending it to serve its own political ends. Remarkably, the state bureaucracy continued to function during the decades of instability, even though the senior management of every ministry fell into the hands of Ba'athists. Centralization of power was a key strategy. Every major party decision was centralized through Maktab Amanat Sirr al-Qatar, that's the Politburo or the party secretariat, which was in essence the party's board of directors. Its functions were drawn up in a clear and meticulous way, and its hierarchy was clearly outlined. The Secretariat oversaw the running of every party branch, which in turn controlled and collected information about every aspect of civil and military life throughout the country. Gathering information was a formidable task. The transmission of information to the leadership was often imperfect because of its sheer volume. But it was also sometimes deliberately inaccurate or embellished to hide inefficiencies or overstated promises made by the local leadership. For Iraqi citizens, Negotiating the bureaucracy's hierarchical structure was a long and arduous experience. Needless to say, decision-making was cumbersome and inefficient, but at the same time it allowed Saddam Hussein to govern without having to fear that too much power would fall in the hands of rivals. The regime's success is also in its ability to attract large number of supporters and make them feel vested in the system. Enrollment of new recruits was a major element of Baathification. In its recruitment policy, the party was particularly concerned to achieve a good percentage of women members and, more importantly, to overcome the aging of the party's cadre. A great deal of pressure was brought to bear on citizens to join the party, and some became members under duress, but many joined voluntarily through conviction or from a desire to benefit from being a Baathist. The documents abound with evidence of citizens applying to join or rejoin the party. The vast majority of party affiliates, however, played little active role because of the party's rigid hierarchy. Only the top 3 levels of memberships were effectively involved in executing policies. Active members were subjected to frequent evaluation, promotion required passing special training courses, immersion in the cultural aspects of the party, and demonstrating the potential to serve in a more senior rank. Even so, a complex web of checks and counter-checks ensured that the privileged few could not become too powerful. The number of party card holders reached about 4 million by the end of 2002. Thus, out of an estimated population of 25 million in 2002, those affiliated with the party constituted about 16.5%, a very high number indeed. But a closer look at the statistics show us a fundamentally different conclusion. The upper echelons of the party represented only 14.5% of the overall affiliates and about 2.4% of the overall population in 2002. And if you look at this, the sympathizers and supporters, which were the lowest and the least active, constituted almost about 60% of the party affiliates. Another reason for the durability of the regime is Saddam Hussein. His role in shaping the history of Iraq over 3.5 decades was paramount. One of my chapters discusses his personality cult and modus operandi. Saddam's personality was very complex, and any attempt to generalize about it in one sentence is bound to fail. While he was ruthless and determined to uproot any opposition, many of those who worked with him said he was also caring and attentive. The audio tapes of the Revolutionary Council meetings and those of the army and party leadership are truly insightful. He was in complete control of all meetings without exception. All attendees respected and feared him, and yet he was polite, rarely interrupted anyone, and if he did, would immediately apologize. At the beginning of each meeting, one could immediately sense his mood, and no one dared to contradict him or say anything that might infuriate him if he were in a gloomy mood. On the other hand, he often sounded jovial, loved to tell stories and anecdotes, prompting other attendees to join in and joke or tell stories. Sometimes he would dwell on an issue in detail and then suddenly become bored, and the subject was immediately changed or dropped. Saddam Hussein unquestionably viewed himself not only as the leader, but also as the father of the nation and of the Ba'ath family. He was convinced that no one understood the Iraqi people as he did or knew their deep aspirations. While this was true to a certain extent because he mastered the art of manipulating different groups within society and ran the country as a personal fiefdom, his instincts sometimes betrayed him, as witnessed by the unexpected uprising that took place at the end of the First Gulf War. Let me turn now to the topic of control. Control was based on a clear system, a parallel system of rewards and punishments. While using extreme violence and terror against its citizens, the regime created a notable parallel system of rewards for its supporters and succeeded in underscoring the necessity and importance for every individual to support it. I will discuss these two issues, first by focusing on an important mechanism of control, which was the security services, and then talk about the reward system. The survival of the Ba'ath Party and its leadership under Saddam Hussein can be largely attributed to the party's ability to expand and control its security apparatus. This system was established long before 1968. But Saddam Hussein perfected its working arrangement and utilized it in ways previously unknown in the history of Iraq. The security agencies were designed to overlap and were structured so as to ensure that no one agency would become strong enough to threaten the region. The securities organization's main task was to gather information through monitoring, surveillance, and by using an extensive network of informers. The Ba'ath file holds copies of the correspondence of the four main security agencies that were sent on a normal basis to the Ba'ath Regional Command or its branches. The archives, however, have a special section of almost 2,000 files relating to the Special Security Organization, SSO, that are truly incredible, and I will focus on this organization given its importance. Sorry, this is not clear in the here. The SSO was the most powerful security agency in Iraq from 1980 until the US-led invasion in 2003, and was run from early 1990s by Saddam's second son, Qusay. Apart from being responsible for the safety of the president and the palaces, many of the departments within the SSO had the task of monitoring the loyalty of officers and employees working in various organizations affiliated with the party or the army. For example, the Directorate of Republican Guard Security focused on the loyalty of military commanders within the Republican Guard. The Surveillance and Information Branch had the responsibility of watching senior Iraqi officials and preparing files on any official prior to his or her being promoted or assigned to a new senior job. Protecting the president was by far the SSO's most significant function, and everything else in the working of the organization was subordinated to that responsibility. On one occasion, the director of the SSO told his employees that, I quote, "The duty of the SSO is not simply guarding the president, but the underlying security concept means that protecting the president leader, may God protect him, is protecting great Iraq." And just to let you know that under no circumstances anyone was allowed to write in any document or memo the name of the president without having between brackets, "May God protect him." Among the close circles to the leader that the SSO was responsible for were workers in the presidential palaces such as electricians, butchers, tailors, a special group that ironed the clothes of the president and his family, drivers, and photographers. Surveillance took many forms of these employees: installing secret listening devices in their homes, telephone tapping at work and home, personal monitoring of after-work activities, and continual gathering of information about those in the inner circles and their families. One problem that faced the security branch and was referred to time and again in the documents was that most of the workers in the presidential palaces, who totaled more than 1,300 in 1995, were Christians. Because these employees spoke among themselves and with their families in the Assyrian or Chaldean languages, it was very hard for the SSO to monitor their telephone calls or to understand conversations that went on at their bugged homes. In one intriguing case, the SSO found out through its informers that the wife of Saddam Hussein's personal chef, also a Chaldean Christian, was addicted to gambling, and in one evening lost the sum of almost $300, which obviously was a very large sum at the time, and that made her a security risk. Saddam Hussein was unhappy with the way the SSO wanted to deal with the issue, which was by immediately arresting the chef and his wife. In one of his rare handwritten comments in the margins of the memo, he stated, quote, "Shouldn't you be more patient, and instead of just arresting them, you should plant one of your employees or informers to play cards at the chef's house so he could report on what is being discussed during those meetings?" Question mark, end of quote. A week later, a report to the president indicated that one of the SSO's employees has indeed begun playing cards with the wife, but no security issues were raised. One might assume that the matter was closed, but the chef and his wife were kept under even more vigilant observation. It should be emphasized here that the practice of hiring ethnic minorities in palaces and security organizations was not an invention of Saddam Hussein. Stalin realized that ethnic minorities, even in senior positions, couldn't constitute a threat for the regime given their lack of a power base. In Iraq, the Assyrian have the reputation of being very tidy and punctual and having no political ambitions, and thus they were a natural group to employ. The real concern for the country's leadership, however, was the people who were on the inside, whether in the army or the security organizations, including the SSO, and this applied to those in senior positions as well. Thus, the insecurity of the masses was supplemented by the insecurity of the governing elite who surrounded the dictator. The files of the SSO are rife with examples of SSO employees being monitored, arrested, and punished. Many had their telephone tapped, and their families were closely watched. Controlling these employees of the SSO took many shapes and forms. Like army officers, officials had to apply for approval to get married. This obviously gave the organization a free hand to collect information on prospective spouses. Numerous files indicate multiple requests for information about employees, mostly without giving the reason why these officials become suspect, but many of them were put under surveillance if a member of their family fled abroad or was arrested for an activity against the regime. The most potent source of information was an employee's personal file. A very detailed 16-page questionnaire was given to applicants, requested exhaustive personal and family details. In addition to the usual personal questions, each applicant was asked in depth about his political beliefs and activities, hobbies, trips abroad, assets, and loans outstanding. Furthermore, there were questions such as the following. Do you smoke? If you do, state 2 kinds of cigarette you smoke. Do you drink? If you do, state the brand of alcohol you consume, quantity, and its impact on you. Do you attend nightclubs? Do you have enemies? Questions about relatives span the entire extended family of the spouse, uncles, aunts, and cousins of the candidate and their political affiliation. Some candidates, however, knew how to manipulate the system. In one file, in an answer to the question of whether the applicant had any enemies, the candidate replied, quote, "Yes, I do. The enemies of the Ba'ath Party are my personal enemies," end of quote. In a report prepared by an SSO employee, the writer put forward two reasons for the success of the SSO operation: total loyalty based on kinship and the substantial reward enjoyed by employees. This frank analysis was based on the fact, clearly indicated by the origins of the directors of the different departments and many of their employees, that belonging to a limited number of trusted families and tribes was paramount in test of loyalty. The 9 heads of the important departments, together with the director of COSE's office, belonged to 5 different tribes and extended families. Although a reliance on families and clans close to the regime was essential for the preservation of power, sometimes it could be a double-edged sword as once a particular clan was considered too powerful or dangerous. The authorities then had to purge the system of all its members. For example, in 1996, an order was issued to single out all those from the Al-Ani clan. As a result, 18 members of the Special Republican Guard, 71 members of the Republican Guard, there is Special Republican Guards and Republican Guards, and more than a dozen from the SSO were earmarked by the authorities, but the records do not tell us what happened to them. The report of the Directorate of Security Affairs was also correct in its analysis of the importance of reward to the organization's success. First and foremost, many employees were granted land and offered loans to build houses. Others had apartments that were fully paid or subsidized by the organization, with the rent directly deducted from the official salaries. Removing these property benefits was among the punishments imposed by the SSO if an employee was sentenced to 5 or more years in prison. There were a lot of other benefits and fringe benefits, including paying for their education at the universities. Let me turn now to discuss the system of rewards. Medals and rewards were the cornerstone of co-optation. Saddam Hussein's regime, like Stalin's, secured the loyalty of its elite by offering economic rents. Indeed, the Ba'ath managed to co-opt a large number of individuals by making it advantageous both to those who became part of the organization and even for those who were outside it to continue supporting the regime. This system co-opted a large segment of the population into dependence on rewards. Tens of thousands of Iraqis were the recipients of different medals, badges, certificates, insignias during the Ba'ath rule. All signified status and privilege, which in turn corresponded towards whatever medals or badges the recipient already had, and the more medals accumulated, the higher the rewards. The most coveted medal, however, or identity card, was called, quote, "Identity Card of the Friends of Mr. President Leader Saddam Hussein, may God protect him." The front of the card was no different from any driving license, and it displayed the holder's personal details. But intriguingly, the back of the card featured a headline called Imtiyazat, privileges, followed by 7 items which are here, and I will read the translation. 5 points to be added to the final average for the holder and his wife and children for applications to schools, academies, and universities during the Iran-Iraq War and for 5 years after its end. 2. Acceptance of the holder's sons in military colleges and academies during the war and 5 years after its end, without regard to their grades or ages. 3, the honor of meeting His Excellency the President at least once a year. 4, grants and holiday bonuses to be awarded on the same basis as those granted to employees of the Presidential Diwan. 5, priority over other citizens in meetings with government officials. 6, each holder or his family to have a personal contact with the Diwan Secretary, the Secretary of the Headquarters of Military Forces, the President's Senior Special Assistant, and the Minister of Defense Secretary in arranging a meeting for any purpose. 7, and last but not least, an annual gift of 2 summer suits and 2 winter suits to be made available from the Presidency of the Republic. This card was originally launched during the war with Iran, and its holders benefited from these privileges then and for 5 subsequent years. However, as the country entered another war and had to contend with a popular uprising in 91, the validity of the card kept being extended and continued to be effective until the regime fell in 2003. Like other authoritarian regimes, the Ba'ath system was paternalistic to its supporters, offering them opportunities and rewards in every sphere. Jobs, financial bonuses, and pensions were all part of the reward system, and without one of the medals or badges, it was difficult to get into the compensation structure. To sum up this reward, Saddam Hussein Ba'ath Party controlled Iraq for 35 years based on this dual system of rewards and punishment, systems that were extensive in range and adjusted to the circumstances of the period. Let me finish by briefly discussing the issue of sectarianism that is having significant implications on daily life in current Iraq. As I mentioned, the Ba'ath Party was obsessive about collecting information on every citizen. And yet, there was one question that was never asked on any form, and that was about the sect. Forms tended to ask 2 questions, religion and nationality. So you could be a Muslim and Kurd or Christian and Arab. I think that it is important to understand that Saddam Hussein regime defined Iraqis not as much by their religion, but more by their support and loyalty to the party, unlike the situation after 2003. Kurds, Shias, and Christians were all part of the system and were involved in its operation and intelligence service. I think that the other important aspect to remember that in spite of Saddam Hussein launching a faith campaign during the late 80s, the regime was basically secular and religious activities of any kinds were considered dangerous and all mosques were kept under surveillance, both Sunni and Shi'i mosques. Ironically, Saddam Hussein and the United States were natural allies in that they shared the same enemies, religious fanaticism and Iran. Documents predating the 9/11 attack clearly indicate the regime's concern about Islamic fundamentalism and its potential impact on Iraqi youth. Wahhabism was banned from the early 1990s and the death penalty imposed on its followers from the mid-90s. Therefore, while sectarianism existed under Saddam Hussein's regime, particularly after 1991, it never became part and parcel of the day-to-day life as it is currently for Iraq. Thank you very much.
I'll just say a few words before we open things up in terms of some discussion points for the book. I mean, the book is, I've had the pleasure of reading it, and it is, extremely well written, which is quite a feat to find pleasure, as I did, in reading over 280 pages of a text about such a horrific regime. It is a fascinating story, and its telling is extremely well executed by Professor Sassoon. What is remarkable about this book is that it really is the first account and analysis based on a staggering number of official internal documents and audio recordings of the workings, the operations, the processes, and the procedures of an Arab authoritarian regime. Previously, in terms of how we tried to go about understanding, analyzing the workings of regimes in this region and in many other regions, has been by trying to closely read and read in between the lines the official statements and government papers that have been put out, by looking at who sits next to who in government meetings, by trying to decipher a policy, because we've had very little access to this kind of insider information and official documents systematically. And so this is what's really truly remarkable about the book, because it delves into the intestines of the Ba'ath Party, the inner workings of the regime. And what we find is remarkably little magic in terms of answering the question of how it stayed in power for so long. We find a tremendous amount of paper, a vast bureaucracy, and incredible tedium. The regime relied, of course, on a ruling party, on the military, on the bureaucracy, on information gathering, and its dissemination in the bureaucracy, sometimes efficiently, sometimes not, and on this system of fear and rewards. And this is how this book, one of the reasons why this book is different than much of the other very important literature that's been written about Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which has focused on violence and coercion and fear. And Professor Sassoon makes it very clear that fear was important, but it was not simply a republic of fear. It was much, much more than that. It was an organization, a bureaucracy, and this system of incentives and rewards. The book will become, in my view, the book for understanding Saddam's Iraq. It'll become essential reading. It'll become the first text that one goes to. There are some things that are somewhat surprising. In addition to the curious details and interesting things that we learn about Saddam and the peculiarities of the regime, Saddam's idea that it was bad and not appropriate to sit cross-legged, for example, his obsession with personal cleanliness and hygiene, his high regard for scientists, natural scientists, who he was in awe of, it seems. And of course, something that we did know, but Professor Sassoon, sheds further light on this, his self-fashioning as a writer, as an accomplished writer of fiction and so on. But there are some things that are surprising on first glance, but possibly understandable. And Professor Sassoon mentioned the one that comes out immediately to me, is the idea that this regime was non-sectarian in character, right? Because when we think of Iraq today, of course, we think of the sectarianism that has so unfortunately marked the last 6 or 7 or 8 years of the regime. But we are told that nowhere on any of the documents is there any indication that the regime tried to decipher whether one was Sunni or a Shia. So it's surprising, but in one sense it is understandable, right? Because this was a Ba'athist regime. This was a secular ideology that placed little regard in its framing of the world on religion, on these kinds of differences. It didn't look at religion as a legitimate difference. It was an Arab ideology. And that's what makes understandable the idea in the documents, not asking people whether they're Shia or Sunni, but whether one is of originally Iranian descent, which seems to have been a crucial factor in determining one's ability to move up in the party bureaucracy, gain positions, and so on. And this was asked, whether one was originally of Iranian descent, and so on. And this gets to other points and so on with regard to the understanding the character of the regime. And this, my next point, gets to what extent can we learn about other regimes in the Arab world from this remarkable analysis of the Ba'ath Party and Saddam's regime? You know, it's not only a typological or academic question to ask to what extent was this regime an authoritarian regime as opposed to, or the extent to which it approximated a totalitarian regime. A regime that really wanted much more than simply to maintain power and the passivity of the population, but a regime that wanted to refashion Iraqi society in its image. And there are examples in which that seems to have been the case. And of course, this dichotomy, you know, isn't necessarily a binary. But it would seem to me then that many of the other regimes in the Arab world, the gruesome and horrific ones like Ba'athist Syria and so on, do not approach the level that that Saddam's Iraq did. And that's really a question. I mean, to what extent can we learn about the worldview, the workings, the processes of Muammar Gaddafi's Libya, or next door, supposedly, ostensibly, a regime guided by a similar ideology, first under Hafiz and then, unfortunately, the son. The other things that, you know, strike me and that I, you know, would like to have some answers for is the question of corruption, right? Because it's not clear. I mean, we know kind of intuitively that there must have been tremendous amounts of corruption. But on reading the book, it does not seem, we know about the corruption in the Oil for Food program and the accounts of Uday and Qusay's extravagance and so on. But on reading the text, it does not seem that the level of corruption in Iraq, and I hope that I'm mistaken in some senses, reached the level that it did in Hosni Mubarak's Egypt with Gamal Mubarak, or in Ben Ali's Tunisia with the Trabulsi family, and so on. And I'd like to kind of, you know, learn a little bit more about that. And I also want to ask whether any of the documents that you've looked at, or possibly the documents that are there, because I think there are, you know, over 1 million, 2 million or so, would tell us anything, would reveal anything about some of the specific major decisions and the decision-making process of the regime, whether it was the decision to invade Kuwait on August 2, 1990, or the decision to lie to the international community or deceive the international community about the absence of WMD and so on, which of course tragically, or one of the things that tragically led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The last thing I'll ask about, and there are many questions that, you know, fascinating questions that come to mind after reading the book, has to do with to what extent was this regime based on a familial system, right? And to what extent was it really based on party and a kind of more institutional system? And that's something that, you know, is curious and something that I kind of wanted to learn more about after I read it. Again, a remarkable book. I think it'll become the book, the first source on Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So congratulations, and it's a wonderful occasion to be celebrating this publication.
Thank you, Samer, very much for these comments. Let me just deal with the 2-3 questions you have raised. Corruption existed correctly, as you pointed out, especially during the Oil for Food program in the 90s, given how the sanctions devastated the whole economy and the society. But there are differences in corruption. The corruption that existed was there, but was really under more constraint and control. One of the things that people told me that I interviewed, some senior Ba'athists, that Saddam would have a one-to-one meeting with people and to do their annual review. And one of the questions is, how much did you earn last year? Well, that was a tough question, because no one knew what Saddam knows. And of course, he knew quite a lot, because you see, for example, reports by the SSO that the son of this minister has just now been conducting an embezzlement of an Italian company against all rules. And he writes in the margins to be kept for further, for the future, in case, I guess, he needs it. And he never says anything. This never comes up in any follow-up. That's it. It gets filed, and he knows he could use it with the minister if he needs it for further reference. I think that there was so much fear of Saddam himself that it was very, very difficult to take the corruption to the level that happened after 2003. If you look at some of the ministers in 2004 who embezzled 40 million, 100 million, and just ran away and went to Jordan, that cannot happen under Saddam Hussein. It's just impossible. And it existed, but never to this level. The documents do reveal about major decisions, and it is very interesting. If you look at the Iran-Iraq war, you could see that the machine went into action long before the war. There was a lot of preparations, there were meetings of the chief of staff, there were internal senior party committees meeting. When it finished, and because the way it finished, and given the fact that it was so long, when it came to the Kuwait invasion, there were very, very few involved. And you don't really see any prelude to it. What you see is a lot of analysis that takes place afterwards. Why did it go wrong? What happened? How come people went on an intifada in the south and an uprising? That happens. I think there were, for example, in the tapes, there were a lot of discussions about the weapons of mass destruction. This was a decision that was made never to declare it, to say that we didn't have it, and therefore everyone was playing cat and mouse with these committees, and there is no fact why it happened, but I think if you really read everything and you realize that Saddam was absolutely obsessed to literally his last day in prison about Iran. There is a book by his lawyer who defended him. There is the trial. He was obsessed and convinced that Iran is going to take over Iraq, and it's taking over Iraq in an ideological way, and therefore he cannot allow them to see Iraq from a weak point of view. The answer to the last question about familiar or party, I think the answer is really both. If you look at the quartet that stuck with him, one of them was half a Kurd, one was a Christian, and one was a Sunni from his area, but not directly related. Later on, there were intermarriages. I think the family and the tribes played a very important, but it really, at the end of the day, for Saddam was, are you 120% loyal? That was the litmus test. Everything else is really, I mean, he punished, as we know, many of his families and tribes and close kin because he suspected them of being not 120% loyal to him.
Great, thank you very much. So maybe we'll take some questions now from
Sure.
the audience, if that's okay? Okay. Yes, Pastor Tucker.
Of course, as you've alluded to, thank you very much, by the way. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. It's a great book. As you and Summer have both alluded to, I mean, the Ba'ath got its start, after all, as an ideological party with a platform, and with people believing in social justice, in classless society or something approaching it, and anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, in secularism. I mean, it was an ideology with a vision. So I think my question is, how, have you looked at all at how and when this unravels? And are there any shreds of, is there anything remaining from this? Are there any fragments? Is there anybody who believes in this ideological mission anymore? Or does it just disintegrate, according to these documents, into this rewards and fear sort of maelstrom without any reference to ideology? And do we have any sense of kind of when that happens? Is there a timeline here that we can establish?
Thank you. I think that's really an important issue, the ideology. In the beginning, as you point out, there were a lot of publications. It was in the party. There is something called the Party Preparatory School, which that's how people were educated and culturally prepared to become full members, and even members had to go through these courses to go to the next level. If you look at the 70s and late 70s, it was a lot about the ideology of the Ba'ath, and ideologists were writing a lot. There were problems from the beginning. Saddam really never believed in Arab unity. This wahda for him was, he didn't even talk about it a lot. I mean, it's very interesting because he felt he's not going to give the keys to anyone else. And then there was the animosity, the ideological animosity from day one with Syria, which was really a problem. But I think your point is critical. It began to unravel, I think, sometimes in the 80s through the war. This Hurriya, the freedom, he decided that freedom is, you want freedom, you want democracy, you vote in the party. If you're not in the party, then you don't get your freedom. I mean, he really said something almost along those lines. Socialism was important. But again, in 87, he decided the economy has to change because it's not responding to the war. And there should be more encouragement of entrepreneurship. And what does he do? He abolishes all labor unions. He says, from now on, the party will represent you. There is no need for labor unions in an equal and fair society like Iraq. And of course, actually, Iraq becomes even more capitalist from that point on, because the labor truly do not have anyone to defend them on issues, given the fact in the 90s was even worse with the depreciation of the currency and the inflation. By the 90s, there is absolutely no reference to ideology. The ideology becomes the cult of personality. You look at the curricula of these schools, you look at the curricula of the Dawrat al-Thaqafiyya, cultural courses that were being taking place in every small branch, and you don't see anything about the three mottos of the party: freedom, unity, and socialism. What it is about? It's all about Saddam. Saddam's role in history, Saddam's role in military victories, Saddam's philosophy, Saddam's interpretation of the religious things. They created the Institute of Saddam for the interpretation of the Holy Quran, and so on and so forth. And that becomes really the ideology, and no one talks about the old ideology.
I would like to know what's the role of Tariq Aziz exactly. And I want to know also what's motivated the U.S. invasion in 1903. I mean, 23. Okay. Is it to introduce a democracy, as they said? Because if they did, the rulers who came as a result of the invasion al-Maliki is not any less democratic. I understand the latest news that he prevented the family of Saddam Hussein to visit his tomb.
Thank you. The role of Tariq Aziz is very, very important. He actually was one of the people who really believed in the ideology of the Ba'ath. I mean, he was a true Ba'athist from the beginning. He knew how to survive, and he kept his distance, yet Saddam knew he can rely on him 120% and on his loyalty. And there was no doubt about this at any point that he was very, very supportive of Saddam and the regime. He's very active in all the Revolutionary Council meeting. He writes on behalf of the regime. He lobbied on behalf of the regime. So his role is very, very important. Yet, like all others, not many could stand up to Saddam. I mean, even when he knew that Saddam is saying or making the wrong decision, he might say it once and you hear it in the audio tapes, but if Saddam repeats it and says, Tariq Aziz, just figure out there is no upside, let's get on with it. And that's really what happened to all of them. The quartet that was around him was never really a consultancy group. It never said to him, don't do this, or we don't think this is a good idea, or how about this totally new idea. Why the US invaded Iraq in 2003? Well, that's a tough question. I think that there are a lot of reasons, some of it ideology, some of it is geopolitical, economic, oil, 9/11, wanted to invade an Arab country to show some kind of force. But, you can, any guess, any one of those is democracy maybe was one of the issues, but I don't know how much really it was the essential aspect of it. Well, I think there are a lot of reports that the new current government is being almost quasi-authoritarian and slowly but surely building up to becoming authoritarian. Maybe they're not using the same way the system that Saddam used or the security services, but the signs are not encouraging at all, and I tend to agree with you that there really are very worrying signs.
Yes.
Thanks again for your presentation. I wanted to ask a bit about all these awards and medals and doodads and whatnot you mentioned towards the end of your presentation. How much, if any, of that has carried forward into the present? I'm particularly thinking about the military, which still traces its lineage to 1921. Is there any controversy that you know of in terms of what awards are sort of Ba'athist Saddam awards and what awards are sort of Iraqi or have sort of more nationalist tone to them, or represent legitimate military service? Is that something that you have a sense of at all?
I think it really depends, because the new government, a lot of people who participated in the Iran-Iraq war feared for their lives. There were reports, which I don't know how true that they were, that a lot of the officers in the Air Force who participated in bombing Iran had to escape, or some were killed. So I don't think people are walking in Iraq today saying, I participated in this or that. I don't think, the current government is very, very anti-Ba'athist, is anti, activities of Saddam. All these medals and rewards because of services to the regime. Some of it were service to the country, but it got melded in the fact, and I don't think, as I said, people are telling others that I used to be a friend of the president.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, did you have, were you given all the complete raw data, or was it filtered through some organization like the CIA first?
No, these are totally raw data. They were here, and now they are at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. There is also a different set of the ones pre the 1991. In addition to being in Stanford, they are also at the University of Denver.
When were these made available?
When were they?
Yeah,
About 3 years ago.
so they've been someplace for 5 or 6 years.
Could be.
And they're all digital, right? I mean, you're not-
I did not work with the physical part. I never saw them. I worked only with the digitized format. The real files exist, and they are at the Hoover Institute. There is an agreement that has been reached between the Iraqi government and the U.S. government that this is the property of the Iraqi government. There is a disagreement about the timing of the return of the physical. And one of the issues that has been raised time and again is the issue that these files have names of everyone. I mean, every informer and his family will be, to a certain extent, at a risk from these files.
Yes.
You know, one of the two justifications for the invasion of Iraq, WMD was the first one, and the second was Saddam's alleged support of terrorist organizations. In the documents that you consulted, were there any new revelations or anything that might substantiate that?
No, I mean, I don't think he had, that's my personal conclusion. There are nothing in the documents about any contact. I think if you really look at the documents and you understand how Islamic fanatics he was, I mean, in the sense of really harassing. There is a wonderful tape that they discuss the Muslim Brotherhood in Iraq, and he says, in general in the Arab world, he says, look, these people, we can't ever live with them. We can't agree with them. They will never accept us as a Muslim country. And I can't tell my people in Iraq that they can't watch a belly dancer on television or that they can't go to a coffee shop. But the order was given to all the security services to tell them, we are your friends, we are going to coordinate with you. And he tells the security services, go and infiltrate them if you can. But this is, I think he was so against any religious activity. It is hard to imagine, having these kind of relationship that he was accused of.
Thank you very much, Joseph.
Thank you.
I've come across studies of East Germany where there's a direct correlation between, there's parallels with what you're saying about Iraq in the sense that as the party doctrine begins to loosen up, you see the security apparatus become effectively more repressive, which I think says very interesting things about the longevity of ideology maintaining authoritarian regimes. But then the question that your description of this incentives programs, privileges programs, prompts me to question you about what exactly is meant by de-Baathification. If it's simply a question of replacing one set of rewards with others, then why is de-Baathification almost always equated with denazification?
Well, I think that was definitely one of the mistakes that was done by the CPA in Iraq, because first of all, as I represented that pyramid, apart from these top three represented only 2.4%, and they were really the active. And even among those, that does not mean that every one of them, without exception, was involved in security affairs or did something wrong. The problem with this de-Baathification and denazification was really misguided. And I don't think that the CPA at the time understood how the system works. The same way they disbanded the army. What happened with the de-Baathification was very simple. They took away all the middle management of the country. I mean, you had to be a party member in order to progress from one job to another. You can be a professor at the university, but you cannot be the head of the department, and definitely not a dean or something like that, if you do not have an affiliation with the party. So the just to go and punish these people, I think, was an extreme case of misunderstanding Iraq, as similar to many of the other missteps that the U.S. Took in Iraq.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Sassoon. My question is about also religiosity in Iraq during the 90s. So after 1991, we know probably that he felt the Iranian ideological threat to increase. At the same time, he prohibited any form of Wahhabism. So did he try to induce any form of alternative religiosity in Iraqi society, like Ba'athist version of Islam? Or was it totally about the cult personality? So are you saying that there was no attempt to create any campaign of faith in Iraq, something like that during the 90s?
No, there was. I mean, officially there was this Hamlat al-Iman, the faith campaign, that was launched in the 80s and intensified in the 90s. Mosques were built. For example, reciting the Quran during Ramadan became, 2-3 hours. More religious programs. And then, as I said, this Institute of Saddam for the Interpretation of the Holy Quran was set up as an academic institution, first in Baghdad, then in Basra and Nainawa, and something like 25% of the students were active member of the Ba'ath Party, who were encouraged to go and figure out how to interpret the Holy Quran from a Ba'ath point of view and from a Saddam point of view. And it's fascinating to look at all the essays and the seminar papers that these students had to write, and everything got filed about these topics. So I think there was a lot of lip service given to religious activity and religiosity. But in reality, there was, inside, there was really no belief, and as I said, very much of anti-religious attitude.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. Great work and great presentation.
Thank you.
Just one question. I think if you remember, by the very last days before 2003, he was speaking to a U.S. reporter, I think, and he told him that I'm looking to the future and I can see that by a year from now we'll be sitting together chatting about the victory that I'll have with the US Army. So having that vision into his documents and into the regime, do you think that he really thought that he would defeat the US Army?
This question is very important because it really talks to what we said about the decision-making process. And one of the fascinating things is there is no doubt that people lied to him throughout the whole period leading to that. There is one of the very few documents after the invasion where one of his aides go to the south and writes a report that he went to check on the Popular Army, Jaysh al-Sha'bi, and all those. And he writes that he is in shell shock because 2 weeks before the visit, before the war began, this head of the group or the branch told the president that he has something like 40,000 people ready to fight to the end. When his aide goes to check why nothing is happening, he sees in the courtyard something like 600, mostly elderly men, sitting. And he says, where is the 40,000? He says, what 40,000? This is written in the doc. He says there are no 40,000. I had to say that. And that gives you the idea. So imagine if everyone was giving something of that level of information. There is also a little bit of delusional state. I mean, his personal translator who did to French and also did his Arabic grammar was told 4 nights before the invasion. At that time, the palace was disbanded, the diwan, no one was working there, everyone was working from secret places, was told to wait for a very important package that will arrive at his house at 10 o'clock at night and not to leave the house. He says in his book that he was convinced that this was a major, major speech of Saddam Hussein to the world, you know, some kind of a deal or something. The package does arrive at 10 o'clock at night, and it is 65 pages of a story he was writing. And in it he writes on the comment, I need this by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Please review the grammar and return.
Great. On that note, join me in thanking and also congratulating Professor Dr.